anti-hazing.
What's up, man? You it's my spot. Oh, okay. Regulated yourself to the corner there?
I like to see everything.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I know. Figured that out. But nice to meet you.
No, yeah, I'm Jesse.
Nice to meet you, Jesse.
Yeah.
I'm Sean. From the back? Yeah.
From the back and front.
From the front too?
Oh yeah.
Alright, we're going to go ahead and get started. Feel free to continue enjoying your food. That's what it's there for. We just ask that you be mindful of the people who are representing. I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Devon Mayer. But before I do, I'm going to make the announcements now, so I have to jump up at the end and try to catch you before you go. Really, the only announcement is to be mindful of the mentoring opportunities that we have with Academy Prep. Remember that you can turn in your applications at any time. And that's a unique mentoring experience because it's available every day of the week between 12 and 1 and from Monday to Thursday between 5 and 6. So if you need pro bono, non-legal, that's a great way to go mentor, tutor, help kids read and get it. Also, on November 18th will be our biggest event of the semester. It's our main event. It's called the Staff Appreciation Luncheon. It'll be out here in the courtyard. It's supposed to be big this year. We're looking forward to having hopefully a Caribbean theme with steel drum musicians, some Caribbean food, and it should be fun. So look forward to that. And so we move to the actual business of today. Like I said, I have the pleasure and honor of introducing this man, Mr. Merritt. But before I give him the podium, I'd like to tell you a little bit about him because if I don't tell you about him, he's not going to. He's an extremely humble man, and other than that, you would only know his name. Mr. Devon Merritt is the child of two immigrants. He's of Cuban, Jamaican, and West African descent. Right now, he's working as a case manager with Capital Medical Society's Foundation's We Care Network in Tallahassee. And what they do is they are a charitable program that provides a safety net to uninsured patients in the community through the donations of specialty medical and dental care. Essentially, they help people who can't afford medical services afford them. Like I said, he is of Jamaican, Cuban, and West African descent, but he was raised in South Florida, Fort Lauderdale specifically. He moved to Tallahassee in 2008 to attend Florida A&M University, and he graduated with his bachelor's in psychology in 2012. In 2014, he graduated with his master's. That degree is in community psychology. After that, while he was at FAMU, he was a member of the March of 100. He actually rose through the ranks and made it to the level of being a drum major, which harps on his experiences that he's going to share with you. From his time in middle school through high school and into college, he was a member of the band, and he was actually a pretty good musician, but that also drew on his experiences that he will share. He was also friends with Robert Champion, who is a drum major that was recently killed, I believe 3 years ago in November. After Robert's death, Mr. Merritt joined FAMU's anti-hazing research initiative for obvious reasons. In that initiative, he helped develop research and essentially explain the myriad of factors that may influence hazing among African American college students. After he moves through his current position, his aspirations are to become a clinical psychologist, and he's going to assist with the development of interventions and strategies to combat hazing and other destructive behaviors. The title of his presentation is Examining the Cultural Factors That Influence College Hazing Among African American College Students. And just a couple other things that I want to mention is that right now he's a grant review team member with United Way of the Big Bend Community Home Services Partnership. He's also a mentor with Big Brothers Big Sisters of the Big Bend area, that's up in Tallahassee. And he has been appointed to be a member of Leon County Health Department's Community Advisory Council. Now, the next part is long, so pay attention. This group was assembled by the Florida Department of Health, the Tallahassee chapter of the NAACP, Florida State University's College of Medicine, Florida A&M University's College of Pharmacy, and numerous political officials within the community. The point of this is so that he helps increase public awareness of health and the quality of life issues within Frenchtown and the Southside communities. And if you're from Tallahassee, you know that those are the most impoverished. And so I have nothing else to say. I hope I've done a decent job of introducing Mr. Merritt, but with that, I turn it over to him.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all on the subject of hazing. The title of today's presentation will be examining the cultural factors that may influence hazing attitudes as well as exposure, specifically among African American college students. As Mr. Wade mentioned in that very humbling introduction, as a student at FAMU, I had the opportunity to serve on the drum major staff for 2 years. I auditioned my freshman year and made it, and at the time I was 17. There was very little that I perceived to be hazing at that point because of my aspirations of being in a certain student leadership position or attaining the perceived respect of my peers. And unfortunately, that same mentality has shown in the case of Robert Champion and countless others to sometimes be fatal. So that was one of the motivational factors behind assisting the university that already had anti-hazing initiative in effect, but just assist with some of the different projects that they had to try and not necessarily explain what's going on, but just examine some different variables that may influence it to help combat some of the destructive behaviors that we see in hazing. In today's presentation specifically, what I want to discuss are just some of the historical backgrounds of hazing and cases in the United States of America, some of the theoretical perspectives that have been suggested by professionals as to what causes hazing. Why would somebody engage in this type of behaviors? Because there are many. And then conclude with some possible interventions that could be implemented to maybe combat some of the destructive behaviors that we see in hazing. What is hazing? Although there's no common definition for what hazing is, it's generally believed to be the abuse of new or prospective group members for the purpose of initiation or affiliation into a certain group or organization. According to the laws that have been set in place by the state of Florida, hazing is any action that recklessly or intentionally endangers someone, whether it's physically or psychologically, for the purpose of admission into a particular group. So there are different things outlined, different activities outlined that would be considered hazing, which I don't mean to insult your intelligence, but I'm sure you guys may be familiar with, but such as sleep deprivation, isolation, paddling, beating, whipping. Those are some of the things that are specifically listed, but there are others. One of the things that are interesting to note in the definitions of hazing, even among the different states that have identified specific laws regarding hazing, states such as Florida and Texas identify specifically psychological and physical forms of abuse as hazing, whereas states such as Maryland only specifically identify and list out the physical examples of abuse that would constitute hazing. Some researchers have suggested that this ambiguity in the definition of hazing could be why some students participate to engage. But once again, there are many different theories which we'll discuss later on in the presentation. Hazing is sometimes perceived as a rite of passage by different members of different organizations and groups. So the crossing over into that group or organization or community is symbolic of maybe a coming of age or a rite of passage. In traditional African societies, rites of passage were considered an essential part of human growth and development. There were many different rites of passages that signified different transitions in life, whether it be the rite of birth, the rite of adulthood, marriage, and even death. One of the more central or core rites of passage in traditional African communities was the rite of adulthood, which took place at the onset of puberty between the ages of usually 11 to 14. And during this specific rite of passage, the main goal was to socialize the youth into the society, so the elders would instill certain core principles and values that would mold the mental as well as moral disposition of these youth, so that they can contribute to the community in a responsible way for themselves, but also for the majority. A lot of the principles that were taught through this formal process were things that we see exhibited in the African American holiday of Kwanzaa. So principles such as unity, self-determination, cooperative economics, faith, purpose. Those principles, whether through tests of endurance, whether through folk tales and mythology that explain the cultural history of the people, through many different ways, they were instilled in the youth to develop these principles that would help them be responsible adults. Unfortunately, some of these same principles are what students are expected to learn or take away from hazing initiations, which we've seen in different examples can turn to be fatal. Before we go and discuss some of the different cases of hazing that have taken place, there's been a term put forward, the Ma'afa, which is a Kiswahili term describing the Great Disaster or the African Holocaust. And this describes a period of enslavement of African people that were taken from 1500s up until through the 1900s from West Africa by Europeans and brought to the so-called New World at the time on the plantations to be forced into labor, chattel slavery. And not only were African people, not only were we physically removed from the continent, but there was a separation in consciousness from spirituality, mental, family structure, traditions, cultural values. A lot of those things were separated when we were physically taken, and then over a process of over 400 years of psychological abuse, physical abuse, torture, so on and so forth, you can see how that separation can almost become separate, not permanently, but can be extremely separate. So some psychologists have suggested that that separation or deviation from certain cultural traditional practices may be an underlying cause or factor for students adopting foreign rituals to mark the conversion into adulthood, such as being initiated violently into an organization or group. Culture has been defined as the collection of a people's history, values, and behavioral norms that are important in social interactions. In 1994, the American Psychiatric Association, when putting together their revised version of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which identifies different disorders and labels them on a continuum or whatnot, they included a cultural formula for diagnosing disorders because there was an overwhelming amount of literature that supported the fact that human problems are best understood when viewing people within their social, cultural, and economic backgrounds and contexts. So that led to Florida A&M University looking at a few different variables when trying to analyze the problem of hazing. Now, the issue of hazing is something that's taken place for many, many years. It has an extended history. The first actual documented case was by Plato in 387 BC. In the 4th century in Carthage in North Africa, in the center of learning, there was a group called the Overturners that forced younger students to perform acts of servitude. Fast forward to the United States of America, the first documented case was at Harvard College in 1657. The first reported death of hazing was in 1838, and that was at Franklin Seminary in Kentucky. From 1847 through 2001, there were over 200 reported deaths of hazing, reported deaths due to hazing. Now, that number may be higher depending on the instance that may not have been reported. On November 19, 2011, FAMU drum major Robert Champion was pronounced dead as a result of blunt force trauma through an initiation process called crossing the bus. So it wasn't something necessarily done to attain a leadership position, because at the time he was already a student leader, but it's something that's done as a ritual to, I'm not sure what the reason is, but nonetheless, even though there were no broken bones in his body, the medical examiner's office did reveal that there was extensive loss of blood due to internal bleeding, and he was pronounced dead the same night as a result of blunt force trauma. A lot of the cases that have been reported of hazing show some differences. In predominantly white institutions, you see more cases of alcohol assumption, sleep deprivation, humiliation acts that are used as the hazing initiation process. And based off of certain state laws, whether it's psychological abuse, they could be categorized as hazing. Unfortunately, in African American organizations, predominantly in HBCU campuses, we tend to see more violent, brutal force acts that are done, whether it's through calisthenics or whatnot, paddling, beating, that are carried out in the hazing activities, and it resembles some of the same activities and experiences that we as a people underwent on the plantation through chattel slavery. Is there a connection? There is, at this point, no scientific empirical data to show that, but once again, that's one of the theories that have been put forward. The most comprehensive research study on this topic of hazing that has been done to this day was done in 2008 by two professors from the University of Maine, Dr. Elizabeth Allen and Dr. Mary Madden. They went to 52 different universities all across the campus. They surveyed 11,482 different students. And they generated 10 key findings based off of their survey, where they asked students things such as, do you consider push-ups to be hazing? And there was a Likert scale, 1 to 5, where students had to rate whether they agreed, disagreed, and how strong they were. What not. The 10 key findings that they came to conclusions based off of the study were that more than half of college students, 55%, reported that they had experienced some form of hazing. Hazing occurs over a wide variety of different groups. So sometimes there's a stereotype that Greek letter organizations or fraternities and marching bands are the ones that mainly haze, but based off of the surveys that they administered and asking students what organizations they belong to, they found instances of hazing in gospel choirs and tennis teams and just a wide range of different activities. Some of the specific things that were identified as hazing were alcohol consumption, humiliating acts, sex acts. There was a knowledge that hazing exists beyond the student groups. More students perceived hazing to be a positive experience than a negative one. So maybe if they felt that they developed some of those same principles that we see exhibited in traditional rites of passage, such as strength or responsibility, then hazing was actually perceived by the student who went through the behavior to be a positive thing. Students are not likely to report hazing to campus officials. Some students reported that they recognize hazing as just a part of the campus culture. Students reported limited exposure to hazing prevention efforts. Some students, 47%, reported that they came to college already experiencing hazing activities, whether it be high school, middle school, and there have been research literature to show that hazing does occur in high school, which helps reinforce the psychologists that have the perspective that maybe interventions should be implemented at a younger age around the same time as the traditional rite of passage, maybe between the adolescent developmental years before a student would arrive to an environment such as the college atmosphere where they would feel hazing is a part of the culture and it may combat some of the students from participating. And lastly, many students who have been hazed don't consider it to be such. So the activity that they may have experienced, they could have viewed it as brotherhood building or strengthening. So that wasn't really hazing, and that gray area and blurred definition can be dangerous. One of the limitations, or not necessarily limitations, but one of the things that stood out with the national hazing study that was conducted by Dr. Allen and Dr. Madden were that based off of their demographics of the different students that they surveyed, 75% of those students were white or Caucasian. There were 7% that were Asian. There were 5% that were of Hispanic or Latino descent, and there were 3% that were of African descent. In 2011, when the Robert Champions incident happened, those two researchers actually came to Tallahassee to some of the town hall forums. They met with some of the professors at Florida A&M, Dr. Jermaine Robertson, Dr. Dina Burney, and they said that even based off of their data and their scientific studies, they weren't quite sure if they understood how hazing was manifested specifically on HBCU campuses, which is one of the motivational factors to partner and use some of their same assessment measures that they conducted across the nation at FAMU HBCU populations, once again, to better understand human problems from that social, economic, and cultural context. There have been many theories put forward for why hazing occurs. In 2011, there was a researcher from the University of California, Aldemo Semino, and he published an article describing three main macro theories, basically umbrella theories that would encompass a lot of the other points that have been made to kind of understand why hazing not only occurs, but persists. The solidarity macro theory is a theory that states individuals who undergo hazing justify going through that because they increase their level of liking for the hazing group. So if they're experiencing any type of cognitive dissonance, or if they're trying to rationalize, why am I subjecting myself to this behavior even if it goes against what I believe intuitively, they might rationalize that for perceiving the group that they're attempting to join as higher. And then because you're almost idolizing that group that you're striving to become a part of, it eases your cognitive dissonance and you're more willing to say, well, this is for this purpose. Okay, that's one theory. The dominance macro theory is that it's the idea that hazing is a tool that's used to reinforce dominance. So once an individual has been subjected to this, they would like to perpetuate that behavior, keep it going, because it reaffirms a sense of dominance in them. The third theory is the commitment macro theory, and that's a theory that just basically states hazing is a process just to weed out the weak and uncommitted. So if you're not willing to go through these challenges and trials, then maybe as a group member you wouldn't be an effective contributor. If something tough came up, you might not be able to see it through. So the rationalization behind this theory is that if you can make it through these specific tests, that can be applicable to any challenge that may come when you're a part of this community now. Once again, the Florida A&M University took many steps after Robert Champion's loss to try and address hazing, speak about it, inform the public, inform the community, and not only just inform the community, but generate some research as to finding out what not only causes hazing, but what values or what things can be bolstered to combat hazing in college students by the time they even reach it. So within this project, there were individual students that had topics, but they were all centered around hazing. So one of the teams that I was on worked on a project that looked at the need to belong and racial identity, and it examined if there was a correlation between individuals' racial identity, the need to belong, and their hazing attitudes and exposure. There were about 150 students surveyed. It was a very small sample size, and there weren't any statistically significant correlations in that study. From my personal opinion, I believe that although racial identity is an important component into someone's value system, and it would influence their decision making when it comes to participating in certain activities, more than a racial identity, it might be certain values, principles that we see exhibited in destructive behavior versus productive behavior of building a community, being initiated, and having a group. So although racial identity is an important variable, there were no statistic correlations in that specific project. The project that I proposed as a research study examined the relationship between Afrocentrism, cultural misorientation, and hazing attitudes and exposure, where I used the same scale that Dr. Allen and Dr. Matter used to get an overall view of different students' opinions towards hazing. And then we added another component to that same scale, which asked, have they ever been subjected to hazing, or have they ever subjected anyone else to hazing? The Afrocentrism scale was a scale developed by Dr. Cheryl Grills, who's a former president of the Association of Black Psychologists. And this scale assesses how much an individual adheres to the 7 principles of Nkuzo, which are the principles that we see celebrated during Kwanzaa, such as unity, Ujichagulia, self-determination, purpose, creativity, those same principles. So the hypothesis was that students who exhibit high levels of Afrocentrism may have more negative or unfavorable views towards hazing and may report less exposure to hazing. Now the cultural misorientation component was inserted because, once again, when that traumatic experience of the Ma'afa took place, there was a disconnect not only physically from the continent of Africa to the people who were brought to the New World, but psychologically, spiritually, through systematic ways, people were broken from their cultural continuity. So cultural misorientation is just a scale that assesses how much a person might adhere to a foreign orientation of culture. So with those three components, we were going to look and see if there were any statistical correlations there, and that was a proposed study. So the terminal degree in the field of psychology is Doctor of Philosophy, and right now I'm still developmentally and my project are both in the same stage of the middle, but we're looking to see if there are any correlations between those variables at maybe the next level. But those are just a few of the studies that FAMU were looking at specifically to try and see if there are any cultural variables that could possibly or potentially account for the whole hazing epidemic. Lastly, just to go over a few culturally consistent developmental programs and future implications for interventions. Some people may have a more pessimistic view of the future due to that disconnect and the traumatic experience of slavery. However, I have a more progressive and optimistic view of the future, and there are many other scientists and people who have implemented programs that also have the same view and have started programs, formal rites of passage programs, with the purpose of instilling those same values and principles that we saw hundreds of years ago on the continent of Africa, and some that are still going on today, but in a modern day sense through different methods. So the first article was on one by Dr. Derek Wilson, who was a Florida A&M University graduate. He's the dean of the Department of Psychology at the University of, I'm not sure exactly right now, but he did a study that evaluated the impact of a manhood developmental program on adolescent males between the ages of 11 and 14. So he had 60 participants, which is a relatively small sample size, but he had half in a control group and other half that went through the process. And at the end of this training program, he recorded academic progress, used some of the same African-centered scales of measurement from an African-centered paradigm. So the methodology and everything, the research was generated specifically to assess how much they adhere to these specific traits. And it was statistically proven that the students who participated did show positive impacts. Similarly, there have been other studies by Dr. Floyd and others who have developed similar programs in Oakland and other places throughout the nation that have programs that don't directly address hazing, but once again, they're fundamentally developed